The morning sun stretched its pale light across the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, casting long, jagged shadows over twisted metal and scorched concrete. In a dim, windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District Administration Building, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rashford bent over his desk, surrounded by teetering stacks of intercepted Japanese transmissions. It was late April 1942, and the exhausted cryptanalyst hadn't seen his family in weeks. His once crisp uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, yet his mind, razor-sharp from endless nights deciphering enemy codes, buzzed with tension. Something enormous was coming. He could sense it in the rhythm of intercepted messages, in the rising tide of radio traffic that surged through Station Hypo like a river threatening to burst its banks. Outside, the Pacific Fleet lay in mourning. 4 battleships rested on the harbor's floor. Hundreds of aircraft had been reduced to charred wrecks. Over 2,000 Americans had perished in the inferno of that infamous December morning. The Japanese had struck with precision and devastating force, leaving the Pacific defenses in ruins. But Joseph Rashford knew something the Japanese did not. America was not broken. It was learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese 4th Fleet," one of his cryptanalysts said, sliding a freshly decoded message across Rashford's cluttered desk. The young officer's voice was steady, but his drawn face betrayed exhaustion. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI." Rashford's weary eyes flickered with sudden intensity. For weeks, his team had been chasing fragments of a massive Japanese plan, something that would eclipse even the scale of Pearl Harbor. But where and when would it strike? The coded designation AF kept appearing in the intercepted traffic, mocking them with its mystery. If they could identify what AF referred to, they might seize control of the Pacific War's fate. Across the harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters, watching salvage crews labor over the skeletons of sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan had taken command of the Pacific Fleet at its lowest point, inheriting a battered force and a shaken nation. Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral, Rashford's team believes they've identified a pattern in the Japanese communications," Layton reported. "Something major is being prepared for early June. The scale, sir, it could be their largest operation since the war began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes locking on Layton. Unlike other senior officers who scoffed at code-breaking as guesswork, Nimitz had learned that intelligence, real intelligence, was the sharpest weapon in modern warfare. "How certain are they?" he asked, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of command. Every decision could mean life or death for thousands of sailors. "Rashford's staking his career on it, sir," Layton replied without hesitation. "He believes the target lies somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team is working around the clock to pinpoint it." Nimitz nodded slowly. If Rashford was right, this could be the break they'd prayed for. The Japanese had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, capturing islands, expanding their empire from the home islands to the shores of Australia. But every empire had limits. Perhaps now Japan was reaching too far. Deep within the code room, Rashford's team worked with feverish intensity. Cigarette smoke and stale coffee hung heavy in the air as IBM tabulating machines clattered without pause, processing thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms hunched over worksheets, hunting patterns amid chaos. "I've got something," called Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright, one of Rashford's top cryptanalysts. "The Japanese keep referencing water desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water supplies for a naval base?" Rashford froze. The pieces fell into place. A location in the Pacific that required additional fresh water, a critical outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii. His mind raced. Midway. It had to be Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes leaned forward, a glint of cunning in his eyes. What if we have Midway report water supply issues in plain language? If the Japanese mention it in their coded traffic, we'll know for sure. Do it, Rashford ordered immediately. Get me a secure line to Layton. Tell Midway to send an emergency message. Say their distillation plant's broken down. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay in sick bay, his skin ravaged by severe dermatitis. The aggressive, battle-hardened commander who had struck the first blows against Japanese-held islands was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to head into the most crucial battle of the war, and he would need to be there to lead it. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond Spruance, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites, Halsey impulsive and fiery, Spruance calm and calculating, but they shared the same unyielding purpose. "Ray," Halsey rasped, "I'm giving you my command. Take my boys, and hit them hard. They trust you. So do I." Spruance nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood naval warfare like few others. His cool logic and respect for his subordinates would soon be tested beyond imagination. On Midway Atoll, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon inspected his small, weather-beaten air group. Rows of aging Brewster Buffalo fighters sat baking in the sun, their flaws well known. Alongside them stood a handful of newer Wildcats and a patchwork of bombers. "Colonel, are we really supposed to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" Major Lofton Henderson asked grimly, gesturing at the lined-up Buffaloes, nicknamed flying coffins by their pilots. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied flatly. "Every minute we hold them buys the Navy time to strike their carriers. That's our job, buy time with everything we've got." Back in Pearl Harbor, the trap was confirmed. Japanese communications referenced AF experiencing water shortages. The target was indeed Midway. Nimitz summoned his commanders for an emergency briefing. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going, and approximately when," he announced. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's brash chief of staff, now under Spruance, studied the intelligence reports. "Sir, our pilots report 6 enemy carriers operational. If they bring them all—" "They won't," Nimitz interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 will head for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The odds were still daunting. The enemy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, commanded by the best naval aviators in the world. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-worn Yorktown, had courage but little experience. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked his maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral. She took deep structural damage. Her flight deck and fuel systems are— "You have 3 days," Nimitz cut in, his tone unyielding. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship sailing." The officer hesitated, then saluted. "Aye, sir. We'll work around the clock." As May 1942 drew to a close, Pearl Harbor became a storm of urgency. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the Yorktown, welding, hammering, and patching. Repairs that should have taken months were forced into 72 hours of exhaustion and sheer will. Men collapsed at their posts, but the work continued, because they knew that every rivet might decide the war. Aboard Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's leading fighter tacticians, briefed his pilots. "The Zero can outturn, outclimb, and outrun us, but it's fragile. Our Wildcats can take a beating. We'll use the Thatch weave, work in pairs, cover each other, and never dogfight a Zero one-on-one." Among the pilots sat Ensign George Gay, barely 300 flight hours to his name, trying to hide his nerves. Everyone knew the torpedo bombers would fly low and slow, straight into the jaws of death, but none hesitated. In the intelligence offices, the full picture of the Japanese plan came together. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, was commanding the operation himself. His strike force, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, radiated confidence. They believed America would never recover. "They're bringing everything," one planning officer reported. "Battleships, cruisers, transports, the works. They intend to seize Midway and launch further attacks on Hawaii." "Let them come," Nimitz said quietly. "The bigger their force, the harder they'll fall." On May 28th, Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, Yorktown followed, her hull still warm from fresh welds. The three carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at Point Luck, a name chosen half in hope, half in irony. As the fleets moved toward destiny, both sides prepared for what would become the Battle of Midway, a clash that would decide the fate of the Pacific. By June 3rd, reconnaissance planes from Midway spotted the Japanese invasion force. The carriers remained hidden, but not for long. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the skies over Midway erupted with the roar of engines. The Japanese strike force, 108 planes strong, raced toward the atoll. Radar picked them up at 5:52 a.m. "Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, an operator reported. Sirens wailed. Marines manned guns. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Major Lofton Henderson led his men into the sky, his obsolete Buffaloes hopelessly outclassed. "Enemy fighters 12 o'clock high," crackled the radio. Moments later, the sky turned into a storm of fire. Henderson's plane went down in flames, but his sacrifice bought time for Midway-S bombers to strike back. At 6:30, Japanese bombs rained down on the island, cratering runways and igniting fuel tanks, but the defenders had survived. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's deputy, Lieutenant Tomogawa, radioed Nagumo. "A second attack is necessary." On the carrier Akagi, Nagumo faced a terrible choice. Should he rearm his reserve planes for another land strike, or hold them ready for naval targets? At 7:15 a.m., he chose to rearm. It would be a fatal decision. While his crews scrambled to swap torpedoes for bombs, Spruance's American carriers had already launched, their aircraft streaking toward the Japanese fleet. By the time Nagumo realized American ships were near, his decks were chaos. Half-armed planes, scattered ordnance, and returning bombers desperate to land low on fuel. The trap was about to spring. The first American strikes came from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bombers and Army B-17s attacking from high altitude. Disorganized and uncoordinated, they scored no hits. The Japanese carriers easily dodged the cascading bombs. Zero fighters shredded the Marine squadrons, but even these doomed attacks forced the enemy to maneuver constantly, delaying their own air operations. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through breaks in the clouds. His torpedo Squadron 8 had become separated from the fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew what it meant. Attacking without fighter cover was suicide. But he also understood that this might be their only chance to strike. "Attack immediately," he ordered, leading his 15 TBD Devastators down toward the enemy carriers. The Zeros were waiting. As the slow, outdated torpedo planes crept toward their targets at wave-top height, Japanese fighters tore into them with merciless precision. One after another, the Devastators burst into fireballs and plunged into the sea. From his cockpit, Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his comrades were cut down around him. Waldron's plane was hit and cartwheeled into the ocean. Others disintegrated mid-air or slammed into the waves in burning fragments. Gay pressed on. Behind him, his gunner, Huntington, fired desperately at the oncoming Zeros until a burst of cannon fire cut him down. Gay released his torpedo at the carrier Soryu, then skimmed so low over its deck that he could see the faces of the Japanese sailors staring up at him. Moments later, his aircraft was shredded by bullets and crashed into the sea. Wounded but alive, Gay inflated his life jacket and hid beneath a floating seat cushion, a lone witness to the battle's climax. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been wiped out. All 15 devastators destroyed. Of the 30 men who had launched that morning, only George Gay survived. Their torpedoes had failed. Some missed, others struck but didn't detonate, yet their sacrifice had not been in vain. The attack had dragged Japan's entire fighter screen down to sea level, leaving the skies above defenseless. More American torpedo squadrons followed and met the same grim fate. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 planes. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. The obsolete devastators and their malfunctioning torpedoes seemed to justify Japanese confidence in their air superiority. But every failed attack forced the Japanese carriers to dodge and weave, disrupting Admiral Nagumo's ability to launch or recover his aircraft. By 10:20 a.m., the Japanese formation was in chaos. Returning planes from the Midway strike circled overhead, dangerously low on fuel. On the carrier decks, mechanics scrambled to rearm and refuel aircraft for a counterattack. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangars, fueling lines snaked across the decks, safety protocols forgotten in the frantic rush to strike back. It was at that moment of maximum vulnerability that Commander Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. He had led his squadrons far beyond the point of safe return. Just as he was about to turn back, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Correctly guessing it was heading to rejoin the main fleet, McCluskey followed. At 10:22 a.m., the clouds parted, and there they were, the Japanese carriers spread below, flight decks packed with fully armed planes. No Zeros rose to challenge them. All were still low, hunting the last torpedo bombers. McCluskey split his formation, assigning targets to each squadron. Then he gave the order millions of Americans had waited for since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Dick Best led his section into a steep dive on Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. He kept his eyes fixed on the growing shape of the carrier below. At 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out sharply, anti-aircraft fire bursting around him. Behind him, his wingman dropped in perfect sequence. Most bombs missed, the stress, fatigue, and chaos of battle taking their toll. But Best's aim was true. His bomb punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar amid fueled and armed aircraft. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. Flames raced across the deck, feeding on volatile fuel and ordnance. Secondary explosions tore through the carrier, turning her into a floating inferno. At the same moment, Kaga was struck by at least 4 bombs from McCluskey's other group, setting off uncontrollable fires among the planes on deck. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown found Soryu and hit her 3 times in a flawless attack. In just 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were ablaze. From his hiding place in the sea, Ensign Gay watched the seemingly invincible Japanese fleet erupt in flames. He saw sailors jumping into oil-covered water, ships exploding in sheets of fire, and knew that his squadron's sacrifice had made this moment possible. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to a cruiser, was stunned. In minutes, 3/4 of his strike force was gone. Only Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest to escape while launching a desperate counterattack. That afternoon, Hiryu's dive bombers found Yorktown. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters, 3 bombs struck home, leaving the carrier listing and ablaze. Damage control crews fought heroically, and by sheer effort, they stabilized the ship until a second wave of torpedo bombers struck, scoring 2 more hits. Admiral Fletcher transferred command to Spruance and evacuated to a cruiser. Yorktown's crew finally abandoned ship, though the resilient carrier refused to sink. She drifted until June 7th, when the submarine I-168 found her and delivered the fatal torpedoes that sent her to the bottom. The loss of Yorktown was painful, but by then, Hiryu had joined her fallen sisters. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise struck again, setting the last Japanese carrier ablaze from bow to stern. 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay at the bottom of the Pacific. As darkness fell, American pilots limped home, fuel tanks nearly dry. Some crash-landed in the ocean, others ditched near destroyers that sped to rescue them. The human cost was staggering, but the strategic victory was absolute. Admiral Spruance, cautious and calculating, resisted the temptation to pursue Yamamoto's remaining fleet into the night. His pilots were exhausted, his carriers vulnerable. He chose to preserve his victory rather than risk it, a decision later proven wise. By dawn on June 5th, the seas where the Japanese fleet had sailed were littered with burning wreckage and survivors clinging to debris. Over the next 2 days, U.S. forces sank the cruiser Mikuma and crippled several more ships. The statistics told the scale of the triumph. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including most of its elite pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 362 men. But numbers alone could not measure the true meaning of Midway. Japan's offensive power in the Pacific had been broken forever. The initiative now belonged to America. For the U.S., the battle validated faith in intelligence, adaptability, and courage. Admiral Nimitz's decision to trust his codebreakers, Spruance's calm under pressure, and the relentless bravery of the pilots had combined to achieve the impossible. Midway was a turning point, a reversal of fortune so complete it exposed fatal flaws in Japan's war doctrine, their overconfidence, dispersed planning, and catastrophic timing during rearmament. Above all, it was the selfless valor of the American torpedo squadrons that made victory possible. Their doomed attacks had drawn the Zeros low, clearing the skies for the dive bombers that changed the course of history. When word of the victory reached home, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeat and despair, the tide had turned. The Japanese Navy, once thought invincible, had been humbled by a smaller, determined force. In Japan, the truth was hidden from the public. Returning sailors were isolated, the defeat masked as victory. But the officers knew. The offensive phase of the war was over. From Midway onward, Japan would fight only to defend what remained. Midway became not just a military triumph, but a lesson in courage, intelligence, and sacrifice. It proved that superior technology meant little without the will to use it, and that free nations, united by purpose, could overcome tyranny. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the balance of the Pacific War had shifted forever. Admiral Yamamoto's grim prophecy had come true. Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His words became reality, written in the flames of 4 sinking carriers and the courage of men who fought and died in that vast Pacific sky. In the decades that followed, historians and strategists studied Midway as a masterclass in intelligence-led warfare. It showed that insight and courage could shape the outcome of nations. Today, Midway Atoll stands silent, a sanctuary for seabirds, its runways crumbling, its barracks empty. But the waters around it remain sacred, a resting place for those who proved that freedom, when defended with resolve and sacrifice, can triumph over even the darkest odds.